DoT Elementalist is an awesome, well-rounded League starter, and I've used it to set myself up for mapping, kill all the pinnacle bosses that I needed, and even do a few things beyond that like the Feared, though my setup isn't ideal for that. So if you want to farm bosses exclusively, you'll either want to look at someone else's DoT build, or maybe look at a different build entirely. However, if you want a League start that can do a little bit of everything, including bosses, mapping, Forbidden Sanctum, delving, and Trial of the Ancestors, you're in the right place. Because DoT Elementalist probably isn't the best build in the game at any one thing, but it can do a little bit of everything with extremely little gear. In fact, DoT Elementalist is so good at leveling that it was one of my fastest times in a long time, going from level 1 all the way to maps. Now the point of this guide is to explain the choices that I made and why I made them, but like with everything, I always advise that you get a second opinion and compare notes if you want to play it for yourself. So starting off with DoT, why do we use 3 skills? Because they all stack. Now normally with a lot of damage over time effects, only the strongest applies, i.e. if you have 5 ignites on the target, only the strongest ignite is actually burning the target. However, because these DoTs are all 3 different effects, you can use them in conjunction. So you take Vortex for passive damage and put it on left click. This way, as you're walking around your map, you're just constantly dropping Vortex puddles. The upside of this is most things that get hit by Vortex will die almost instantly, making the build play very similarly to RF. The downside is you can't see the floor, so in certain situations it is going to make life harder for you, which is why I personally don't recommend this for bossing. I very much like to be able to see the floor when I'm bossing. Next up we have Cold Snap and Vol Cold Snap. Cold Snap is a great thing to fire at range as it covers a wide area of effect and can be used to freeze enemies. Vol Cold Snap, on the other hand, has a kind of rotating cold RF pseudo aura. When you activate it, you just run through the map and everything around you dies. So not only does this make your clear much faster, but it adds much needed single target, and a little bit of crowd control. Then third up, Creeping Frost is simply a little bit more damage when you want to stop and cast something such as on a boss or Tenkiei rare monster. Now one note, you can use Elemental Focus because the chilling zone still chills enemies, but I would advise only swapping to this when you can use Awakened Ele Focus for the +1 level. Until then, use Cruelty Support, it's pretty darn good while mapping even if it falls off later when you start bossing. Early on, having that extra defense, freezing all enemies that walk near your vortex, is pretty efficient. And I would never use Ele Focus on something like your Cold Snap, as you want to be able to inflict shock for your Elementalist Ascendancy. Next up, another really important mechanic for a build is Eye of Malice. This is where most of our resistance and damage scaling comes from. Eye of Malice reads that nearby enemies have 50% increased cold and fire resistance, which it sounds like it's buffing them. But in fact, it means you're multiplying the number by 1.5. So what if you set that number to negative by using Frostbite, Elemental Weakness, Exposure, further increased by your Ascendancy, Snowforged, Scorch, and Void Beacon? Well, if my math is correct, and feel free to correct me down below if I somehow got it wrong, it means you get to set regular enemies to around negative 200% cold resistance, or 130-ish% before Eye of Malice and 200% afterwards. This also sets bosses to around negative 125%, and if an enemy is hyper-resistant to cold, say it has 95% base res, this would set them to a negative 57%. So in short, it's a massive, massive damage multiplier. As one note here, while I am using Void Beacon to further scale enemy resistance down and stop them from regenerating, you don't have to. In fact, I'd advise that you take Frigid Wake for more defenses rather than Void Beacon. The reason that I used Void Beacon is it cost me 6 divines for my Flesh and Flame, and it was closer to 60 when I was looking at Frigid Wake. But prices are constantly shifting, so like everything, you should look this up for yourself before making a decision. Next up, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the build's defenses. The main source of physical mitigation is damage shifting, taking physical damage as lightning and cold, lightning from Lightning Coil, and cold from Taste of Hate. Though, if you wanted, you could easily swap the Lightning Coil out and use a Cloak of Flame instead. You'll just have to fix your spell suppression, probably by dropping Legacy of Fury. Now, one of the main reasons to do this is the Elementalist Ascendancy has a Primal Aegis that absorbs elemental damage taken. Shifting over 50% of your physical damage to Elemental means that that Aegis is applied to your physical damage taken as well. Another advantage is it's kind of difficult to scale armor while wearing evasion gear, and if you don't scale a lot of armor, big hits are far more effective at punching through. So by shifting it over to Elemental, the build leverages resistances instead, meaning that the build is just as tanky against a monster that hits for 1,000 and a monster that hits for 15,000. A few other defenses include Spell Suppression, block, and ailment immunity via Storm Shroud. The spell suppression is absolutely mandatory, otherwise bosses will wreck you, and that's why we're wearing primarily evasion gear, plus using the aura Grace with the Watcher's Eye. Now, while block isn't strictly necessary, it does help to smooth out your damage intake, and, via a loyalty tattoo, gives a massive amount of burst recovery. And these days, ailment immunity is much more important than it's ever been in the past. So, by getting a Storm Shroud and using a Essence of Torment rolled Stygian Vise, with a dual socketed that has chance to avoid shock, you can be immune to every ailment, and this includes alt ailments like Scorch that would lower your resistances. Grace provides a bit of avoidance, and Recoup is used for recovery, along with a Life Flask. If you really wanted more recovery, you could also go into a Blood Notch setup. I tried it for a bit, and it didn't really make a noticeable difference, because the build's recovery is already really good while mapping. So now, let's head over to PoB to talk about skills, passives, and tattoos. So here we have the build skills, starting with Creeping Frost and Vortex that are dual linked in the chest piece. Now they are 21-0 because while extra AoE is nice, this is something like 2 or 3 divines for 21-20s, at least last I checked. Obviously prices vary over time and generally over the course of a league tend to go down, but I wanted to demonstrate that you don't need an expensive 21-20, you can just use a 21-0, which is much more economical. For Awakened Gems, we have Awakened Controlled Destruction. Now this is great because you don't need to crit for damage over time, in fact it doesn't apply, and normally bonuses to spell damage would also not apply. However, both Vortex and Creeping Frost say, modifiers to spell damage apply to this skill's damage over time effect, meaning you can stack the nice Awakened Controlled Destruction. We've also got Swift Affliction for more damage over time with less duration. Vortex has a fairly short cooldown and a fairly long duration, so it's easy to maintain 100% uptime, and Creeping Frost is pretty darn spammable. Awakened Elemental Focus for the +1 gems and 39% more elemental damage, this does apply to the DoT. And then an Empower 4 to raise the level of supported skill gems. If you can't get an Empower, stick to Cruelty, although keep in mind you will take a damage loss on bosses when using Cruelty. Next up is some utility links with Portal and Frostblink. Frostblink is my mobility skill of choice, and I picked the Divergent to have extra cooldown rate when teleporting into large groups of enemies. Then there's Arctic Armor with the Anomalous for a chance to freeze enemies when they hit me. Arctic Armor is a great way to take less both physical and fire damage from hits, especially if you're stationary. Now this build is relatively mobile, but I've found that usually when I'm getting hit and taking a lot of damage, it's because I stopped at the wrong time. So having something like Arctic Armor fixes that at least more often than it doesn't. And as a 25% aura, it's very economical and easy to fit in. If you did drop Tempest Shield, you could use Determination instead of Arctic Armor. That would be more physical mitigation in some circumstances and a lot less in others. But I went with Tempest Shield for the extra spell block, and I'm then doubling that via Glancing Blows. Then for my other permanent auras, it's Malevolence for damage, great on DoT builds, and Grace for additional defenses, all with an Enlightened 3, just to fit that in. Next up, cast on damage taken, Anomalous Steelskin. Anomalous means the buff takes more damage, and this is a pretty darn solid defense. Though if you want something to trigger more frequently rather than a bigger buff, you can go with Immortal Call instead. Let me just put that in for sake of demonstration. So Fizz hit 21,595 versus Fizz hit 2844. Basically the same thing. It's just a matter of at low levels, Steelskin won't do anything. Whereas at low levels, this is pretty darn efficient. Unfortunately, this has a shorter duration, so I found that Steelskin feels better for me personally. This is a matter of taste though. Go with your heart on this and try out both. Also, you can use a much lower cast when damage taken with the level 1 or so Immortal Call. Then there's the temporary aura, Hatred. You want to use Hatred for extra damage, and it is a Divine Blessing, meaning this is going to eat most of your mana when used. The Divergent Inspiration is important, without which you're probably not going to have the mana to use this aura. As you can see, the cost here gets plus 233 mana from Divine Blessing. Then we have Val Cold Snap, the primary clear, and Bone Chiller. Bone Chiller increases the enemy's cold damage taken. So this applies not only to the Cold Snap itself, but also to your Vortex and your Creeping Frost, making it a very good way to get extra damage, and also because we're chilling and freezing very efficiently. And this is also why we're using either an Empower or a Cruelty here. You would use Cruelty only if you also have it in your main links, rather than something like Awakened Elemental Focus. Though if you really wanted, you could use Unbound Ailments as well for both the Shock and Chill effect. Last but not least, we have Elemental Weakness for build's second curse. The first curse is a Frostbite on hit ring. We've got an Oriaths for Explosion and Primal Aegis from our Ascendancy. So that's about it on the skills. Next, let's take a look at the tree. I would say this is one of several things that you can do on cool.dot Elementalist. So I'll talk first about the things that I didn't do. A lot of builds come up to Sovereignty while also taking Purity of Flesh. You can have a path up this way and around, or you can path here, here, and through here. The reason I didn't do this is I got a Corrupted Helmet, so I didn't need the extra mana reservation. You might need it, in which case you'd want to path up here, and you'd likely have to sacrifice the block. Now additionally, I didn't come over to Magebane. That's because I found on a point-for-point basis, Inveterate was simply better. It doesn't give you access to the life wheels of Profane Chemistry and Hired Killer, but in Path of Exile 3.22, Trial of the Ancestors, that's not an issue because you can just tattoo life wherever you want on your build. So don't worry too much about lacking those life wheels. Then for the rest, I think it's pretty much a standard tree, getting Eldritch Battery to of course ignore mana costs, and grabbing a Celestial Jewel here just to have extra jewel sockets. Personally, I found I was dying to damage over time a fair bit, so Leth Shade is great. Take 50% less damage over time if you've started taking it within the past second. So you get about a second for free, and then it starts to really hurt. The more duration of ailments on you will apply to poison and will apply to bleed, but you don't have to worry about being ignited or something like that because you're ailment immune. Elemental ailment immune, at least. As for tattoos, I've got a lot of them. So I'm going to talk about the ones that are distinct enough to be important, because having a bunch of Honored Tattoo of the Oak, yeah, they're great filler, but they don't really matter. The way I treated this was putting Honored Tattoo of the Oak as filler wherever I didn't need the stats, so I'm at exactly my stat requirement. The first one is Tattoo of the Valako Shieldbearer and Tattoo of the Valako Shaman. This way I have plus 2% chance to block both attack and spell damage, bringing me to 74-74 instead of 72-72. Coming over here, I also grabbed a couple of Tattoo of the Valako Stormrider, just because I needed to cap out my lightning resistance. You may and may not need to do this, depending on your gear. And then, coming down here, I took an Honored Tattoo of the Wise for +1 to level of all intelligence skill gems, as it is a pretty nice 13% DPS boost. Last but not least, I am using a Loyalty Tattoo of Kilowava, which, when you block damage from a unique enemy, summons a Spirit of Kilowava. This will give you a massive amount of burst healing, because it gives you about 20% recovery for life, mana, and energy shield on block. Alternatively, you could use the Loyalty Tattoo of, I believe it's Awana? Yeah, the Suppression one, which will make your spell suppression far more effective. Which one's better? Well, it kind of comes down to personal taste. Awana will be up far more frequently, but only applies to spells, whereas Kilowava is up less frequently and applies to both spells and attacks. While mapping, I personally like Kilowava because usually the unique enemy is dead by the time it drops, but if I was going to do more bossing, I would absolutely be swapping my Loyalty Tattoo to Ahuana because it's only like 2 or 3C to swap these. One last very important note when it comes to capping your spell suppression. Revenge of a Hunted gives 10% chance to suppress spell damage while on full life. PoE accounts for this, and will only display it if you are always on full life. In-game, you're probably on full life in your hideout, so it will show up as 10% higher than it actually is. Be aware of that, and don't get tricked. First up, my wand. I just grabbed all cold spell skills and used Essence of Woe until I got spell damage and dot multi. At the time that I did this, Deafening Essence of Woe was about 2C each, making it very economical to spam these, and I was selling the finished item for between 2 and 4 divines, paying around half a divine for the base, using maybe a divine in essences, so I was able to efficiently and profitably craft myself a weapon. Some modifiers to look out for though, in case you want to do something different. All cold spell skills, all spell skills, spell damage, cold damage, damage over time multiplier, cold damage over time multiplier. And trigger a socketed spell when you use a skill would be a very nice way to automate things instead of a cast on damage taken. Next up, one of the core items for the build, Eye of Malice. Now, you could get something like a Vortex cooldown recovery rate to make your wrapping more efficient. I just completely forgot about that, because it's not super build enabling. The most important part though is socketed skill gems get a 90% cost and reservation multiplier. This allows you to use an Empower 3 and get the extra aura efficiency. If you don't have that, you'll most likely need an Enlighten 4, and you'll also need skill reservation tattoos. Because this is a multiplier rather than reservation efficiency, it multiplies with your reservation efficiency, making it highly effective. For my chest piece, I have a lightning coil with +2 to socketed duration gems. Now, +2 to socketed duration or AoE, or +1 to socketed gems are completely optional, but it does add a good bit of damage. You can use either lightning coil for the additional spell suppression from the mastery, or Cloak of Flame for additional life from the mastery. And Cloak of Flame has the added benefit that the shifting applies to corrupted blood, so you don't necessarily need a corrupted blood jewel. As a note, you also don't necessarily need one if you're good at hitting your life flask. Just be aware, it's very easy to die if you're not paying attention and you're relying on a life flask like my current setup is. Use with caution. Basically, do what I say, not what I do. Now for my gloves, I rolled these with Essence of Delirium. That's for the socketed gems deal 30% more damage over time to boost the effectiveness of my Cold Snap. I did this on a chance to suppress spell damage base, and as a note for my exact gear, I didn't end up needing the 13%, but hey, I had it, so I decided to stick with it. I did this until I hit another good suffix, in this case tier 1 fire resistance, and then I did suffixes can't be changed via a Wild Bristle Matron, and used a Veiled Chaos Orb. I blocked something and then unveiled to get +2 to level of socketed AoE gems. This is the best way to maximize your damage, but you could instead opt for defensive stats instead, such as more life. After that, I just crafted life and called it good. For my prefixes, I did cold exposure to have a little bit more reliability than what is provided by Eye of Malice, and cold damage over time multiplier. If you really need, you can get additional suppression as a prefix, such as if you weren't taking some of the suppress nodes on the tree. For my belt, I rolled this with Essence of Torment, just rolling until I hit something like Chaos Res or Life, which I got pretty lucky with here. And I combined this with Chance to Avoid Being Shocked on my Ghastly Eye jewel. Doesn't have to be a Ghastly Eye, they roll on all the jewels, just Chance to Avoid Being Shocked, maybe some Resistances, Life, whatever else you can fit in. I'm also using Legacy of Fury, since it provides damage and a pseudo-explodey AoE, burning nearby enemies. I happen to have a really well-rolled pair, but realistically, any pair will do. And as a note, while I do also have the Oriath's End for faster mapping, if you're doing more bossing, you could just replace this with rare boosts, and you could instead replace the Oriath's with a Progenesis. Those are not core items to the build. For my shield, I kind of used it as a problem solver, cold spell skill gems for damage, then res, energy shield just to make my skills a little bit easier to use. A little bit of intelligence happened to be rolled on it, and maximum life. I'm looking for any base with a 25% chance to block, such as a titanium or thorium spirit shield. You could get more damage with an increased damage prefix, or spell damage as an implicit, but you'll be a little bit squishier. You could get block as a suffix. There's a lot of options here, which is why I say it's a good problem solver. You can even give up damage entirely here, and go with something like spell suppression, or use an Edziri's Reflection for, I think, even more damage, though you might need a third curse for that. On my amulet, I anointed Ash, Frost, and Storm because, number one, it's very cheap, and it's also very efficient in terms of the damage it offers. I was looking for amulets with level of all cold skill gems and damage over time multiplier. I happened to pick this one up, which not only had an open prefix, but chaos resistance as a suffix, making it a very lucky find. You'll probably need this chaos res somewhere else, because I don't think you're going to be able to reproduce this item. And then for my rings, I essence crafted both of them just like I did with my gloves. For one, I started with a fractured Chaos Res Amethyst base because I indeed needed Chaos Resistance, and for the other, I went with a synthesized Frostbite on hit, though you could easily get either Frostbite or Elemental Weakness on hit as an explicit, dropping the Recoup. Recoup feels really good, and even the damage over time multiplier feels good, but they're not strictly mandatory to the build. Just make sure to use this to fix things like resistances like I have here. Then for my flasks, a Staunching Flask to deal with bleed, Oriath's End for explosive clear speed, Taste of Hate to mitigate physical damage, Quicksilver to go fast, and Jade Flask for extra evasion. This feels really good while mapping, but you could easily swap it out for something else while bossing. And then here are my jewels. Number 1, the Storm Shroud, needed for ailment immunity. Number 2, a Watcher's Eye, needed to cap out my chance to suppress spell damage. And then there's a little bit of extra damage. You can either get a Hatred or Malevolence modifier for DPS. It just so happened that this was 4 divines, and the equivalent with the Malevolence modifier was like 40. I don't know if the market is now. That was fairly early in the league. Coming up here, Cluster Jewel, getting a little bit of extra chance to block from Conjured Wall. Essence Rush is just what it happened to have. I was not very picky. There's no special reason to use this. I just wanted Conjured Wall. Grabbing Cold Dot Multi, Max Life, and Dot Multi on my jewels. Coming over here, I've got my Forbidden Flesh for Void Beacon, and over here, Forbidden Flame for Void Beacon. Also, if you're wondering why the tattoos don't quite match up what I have in my POB, it's because I just spent time in my POB optimizing them, and I've been too busy making this video to buy all the tattoos and apply them to my skill tree. So if you want a POB, just head over to my Discord, link is down in the description. React to give yourself both the notification and community roles so you can see all the channels, then head over to the build link archive where you'll find it. On the other hand, if reading is more of your thing and you want a written guide, Tripolar Bear has a full written guide over at MaxrollGG, which I'll also link down below. Overall, I don't remember the exact differences between his setup and mine. I know in a lot of ways the broad strokes are very similar, but there's going to be slight differences just down to personal choice. If you want, you can just follow his, or if you want, you could start with his, then swap over to mine when you reach a higher level, because his does a much better job because his setup will do a much better job of guiding you through the early levels and getting you to maps. With that said, what's the gameplay like? Because as I mentioned at the top, this was my league starter, and it was one of the best leveling experiences I've had in a long time. While gearing up, my damage was great since I was getting the base damage from 3 different skills, so even when I just had each of them in 4 links, it felt totally fine for early maps. And I set myself up for mapping to the point where I was easily able to do pinnacle bosses. I did Maven invitations and all the way up to the Feared. But of course, for encounters like the Feared and Uber bosses, it's going to come down more to your skill personally as a player and a little bit less for the build. A lot of builds are very Feared and Uber viable, but you may and may not be a Feared or Uber viable player, and the only way to get better at it is just to practice. And since I primarily set the build up for mapping, a few things that it excels at. Number 1, low tier essences and beasts. Due to the passive damage, you just run up to and kill what you want, then ignore the rest of your map. Alternatively, you can do what I've done recently with Harvest, where you just drop cold dot puddles all over the entire Harvest patch, activate it, and you're good to go. Combining that with Harbinger, where you can do the exact same thing, just watch out for Harbinger ground effects, they're a little bit nasty. And Expedition for the big boom, cause with any exploding effect, you clear out the packs very efficiently. Personally, I like Harvest, Harbinger, Expedition, but there's plenty of other viable strategies since, as a well-rounded build, I also did quite a bit of Trial of the Ancestor, where I essentially act as a CC bot, where I let most of my teammates do the hard work, pushing enemies back and taking out their totems. Alternatively, you can take the build Delving, just run along the path, following the cart, and drop cold dot everything over the node. Or you can even enter the Forbidden Sanctum. Now, I will give a word of warning here. This is not a great build for Forbidden Sanctum, not because its mechanics aren't excellent. Slowing enemies is good, and you're reasonably tanky. Unfortunately, you also cover the floor, which makes it very difficult to avoid traps. So maybe don't do Sanctum, though, as you can see here, if you know what's coming, it's not that hard to dodge, it's still definitely doable. Just be very cautious. And you may have noticed a lot that there's several buttons to the build, but I'm not pressing them very frequently in gameplay. Most of the time, Vortex is plenty of damage to clear or even kill a random rare. The only time that you need to press Cold Snap is A, when Vol Cold Snap is up, because you then want to run through enemies, or B, when it's a really tanky enemy or a boss. And the same goes for Creeping Frost. A lot of the time, I'm not even using Elemental Weakness until I get to one of those tankier encounters. So while you do have 3 additional buttons that add to your damage, you don't need to press them most of the time, putting this honestly in line with a lot of other builds that have a lot of buttons to increase their damage but don't need to be pressing them frequently. In fact, a lot of the time when I'm just mapping, the only thing I'm pressing is my Frostblink to get around. Alternatively, if you like to move a little bit faster, you could shield charge, but the socket pressure is going to be tough and you'd likely have to drop the Hatred aura, losing damage. Though speaking of, if you wanted to drop an aura and go full glass cannon, you could absolutely do that by dropping Grace for Zealotry for even more damage. And if you're feeling really ambitious, maybe consider running Permanent Righteous Fire on the build? It'll take quite a bit of regen, but I think especially with tattoos, it's not that difficult to get there. Maybe replace your shield with something that has all max res, just to mitigate some of the damage that you take. And those are just a few interesting ways that you could keep playing the build and min-maxing it, which is something that I may and may not do. So if you want to see what I do with a build next, or what build I reroll into, be sure to get subscribed and leave a like while you're down there. But now I'm curious, how many buttons do you think would be ideal for a Path of Exile build? I'm not going to count things like auras that you don't really have to press unless you mess up, but how many buttons do you actively want to press? Is it 4? Is it 2? Or maybe it's 0? And how much are you willing to give up to get a build to that state? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. And if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe you're wondering how I made the currency to be able to afford this build, check out how I farmed my first 100 divines in Trial of the Ancestors, my 0 to hero journey for the current league. I'll leave a link to that up in the card and down below, along with some other recommendations for you to check out. Now with that said, I want to take a moment to give a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make sure I have time to make build guides like this, because a video like this takes 3 or 4 times as much time as a lot of my average videos, meaning I can't make them too frequently, and the more support I have from Patreon, free of the YouTube algorithm's influence, the more I'm going to be able to focus on it. Link to support is down below. And with that said, thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, good luck on your Path of Exile journey, and I'll see you again sometime soon.